What a delight it is to be here. Thank you for that inspiring message, President Nikias. And to Jeff Cowan, congratulations on the amazing job you and your entire team have done putting this weekend together. It's extraordinary. I am so delighted to be here. I have already tweeted about the Sunnylands moment. But I'm truly excited to be here to have conversations with a group of extraordinary people, and you see two of them sitting next to me right now. I have to say, though, as Jeff Cowan said, I'm really used to sitting on the dusty road outside of Sunnylands in a press pool van, waiting for President and Mrs. Reagan to come out at New Year's Eve or one of their other many, many visits to the Annenberg estate. It's great to almost be on the inside. But my main role this morning is, as you, I'm sure, know, to give these extraordinary individuals a chance to share with you some of their thinking, some of their ideas about the most important questions facing our country today. My job is simply to keep the conversation moving. If we have time, maybe to take a couple of questions from the audience. And we are so fortunate to be able to begin this morning with two of the most significant figures in American foreign policy and American national security. I don't have to tell you who they are. Secretary George Shultz, who served as Secretary of Labor, Secretary of the Treasury under President Nixon, served as Secretary of State under President Reagan. And, of course, Secretary William Perry, who served as Undersecretary of Defense under President Carter and as Secretary of Defense under President Clinton. So between the two of them, they span so much of this current lifetime of change in the United States. I just want to pick up just quickly with you, Secretary Shultz. Just give us a sense of the kind of conversation that did take place here. It's what they want to take place at Sunnylands and near Sunnylands, but it's already happened. It was happening in their home.
Oh, yeah. When you came to visit Sunnylands, Lee and Walter would distribute to you the names of the other guests, the names of the guests at each lunch or dinner, with a little bit of bio about them. And then the whole idea was to create an interesting conversation of some kind. And it always worked out. Of course, there were some interruptions, like, for instance, at the New Year's Eve dinners, Bob Hope told jokes all the time, kept everybody in stitches. And Dolores Hope, with that wonderful voice, would sing. So it was a lot of good fun.
You mentioned there was one particular conversation you had with President Reagan. It was in the middle of a particularly tense time with then the Soviet Union. You want to share just a taste of that?
Well, it became a tradition that the Annenbergs always gave these wonderful New Year's Eve parties, and I always had a game of golf with Ronald Reagan on those occasions. And afterwards, on a few occasions, we'd go into the Room of Memories, a wonderful room in the Sunnylands where a lot of pictures of the Annenbergs with kings and queens and presidents and whatnot are around. And we'd have a conversation on one in New Year's Eve toward the end of 1983 were a very tense moment because we'd had long negotiations with the Soviets over intermediate nuclear forces, that is, missiles with a range that the Soviets had deployed, which would go to Europe, and also strategic forces, but the INF particularly. And we had an agreement in NATO that I think was a carryover from the Carter administration, that we'd negotiate in good faith, and if we couldn't come to any agreement, we would deploy weapons of our own, the same range. The Soviets had about 1,500 deployed. We had 0. So Ronald Reagan's proposal was that we both wind up with 0, and people thought it was ridiculous. That was our proposal. Anyway, we had these negotiations. They did not come to a satisfactory conclusion, and we deployed. And the deployment process was really a tense matter. And touch and go to a certain extent, particularly in Germany, but we pulled it off. And the Soviets put out lots of war talk. It was a tense moment. So we come to the Annenbergs' New Year's Eve party and our golf game. And afterwards, President Reagan and I went into the Room of Memories, and we had a really exceptionally long talk about the situation, what to make of it, what we should do. And we thought, well, we keep on our same course, stiff backbone. We've deployed allies with us. At the same time, the Soviets had walked out of negotiations. We're ready to re-engage. And so we worked out a strategy that started with President Reagan making a kind of a high-level speech, and then I had a meeting in Stockholm with a bunch of foreign ministers and a side meeting with Gromyko, that I would make a more operational one. So we had a sort of 1-2 punch. And then we stuck with it, and gradually it worked out. But that was
but it all came out of that conversation.
Well, it was the basic structure of what we did emerged out of that conversation. And then it was fun because gradually the situation softened. And by the summer, this was not at Sunnylands, but down at LA, I came down to be with the president. And I was able to tell him, Mr. President, after all this huffing and puffing on the Soviet side, in 4 different embassies, a Soviet person has come up to one of our people and said almost exactly the same thing, which amounts to a statement that if Gromyko is invited to come to Washington for his traditional meeting, he'll accept. In other words, they blinked. And I said to him, Mr. President, you probably want to think this over, because when they invaded Afghanistan, President Carter ended this kind of conversation, and they're still in Afghanistan. He said, I don't have to think it over. Let's get them here. So we had a little diplomatic minuet, and that started. This was all prior to Gorbachev, I might say.
Right. What
anyway,
a fascinating.
In some ways, it had a lot of Sunnylands in it.
Well, it gives you a taste of what has happened at Sunnylands, and what it's clear that the Annenbergs would like, the kind of conversation the Annenbergs would like to continue. I want to plunge right in, though, with a big question for both of you. I want to turn to you on this, Secretary Perry.
Could I put in just one note?
Sure.
I want to remind the president of USC. I mean, it's a great school and all that. But
I think I know where we're headed on this.
But Lee Annenberg, I think, grew up in L.A., but when she came time to go to college, you know where she went? Stanford.
You know what? California is filled with great institutions of higher learning. One of the questions, 30 years, 3 decades after what we just heard from Secretary Shultz, there are so many big questions floating around Secretary Bill Perry. And one of them is, one of the very basic ones is, what is the U.S. role in the world anymore? We heard President Nikias talk about the changing world that we live in. It has changed enormously. The U.S., how does the U.S. change with it? What is the role of this country in the next decade and beyond? If we're not the world's policeman, that favorite phrase, then how do we fulfill the role that we were meant to play?
Let me start off by noting that many people seem to like to say the United States is in decline. Whatever role we're playing, we're in decline. I think that's bunk. Let me make a few points. The United States today is the world's dominant military power, not the world's largest military power, the world's dominant military power. And whoever is second is far behind, and that's likely to be true for at least a decade in the future. That's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of military leaders all over the world, including Russian military leaders and Chinese military leaders. Whoever is second, by the way, is not Russia and China. It's a combination of our allies in Europe, Germany and France and the United Kingdom. In Asia, it's probably a combination of Japan and South Korea. So we wring our hands about things, but let's keep in mind, we are the dominant military power in the world, and the second in line are our allies. So that's one point. But there's also the issue of innovation, which we heard about in our keynote speech today. The U.S. is the world's leader in innovation, from the IC to the PC, to the .com, to the smartphone, and now Facebook. All of those innovations, which are used all over the world, happened right here in the United States. So the question is, what about the next big thing? Where is the next big thing going to occur? Well, the next big thing, these innovations take a combination. Something overlooked is the infrastructure, our legal structure, our financial structure, our venture capital companies, and so on. They're here. There's nothing like them in other countries in the world. The universities, particularly the scientific and technical universities, they are here. It's Stanford, it's USC, it's University of California, it's MIT, it's Caltech, it's Princeton. Those are the universities that are recognized all over the world as the leading universities in the world. They send their people here to get science and technical education. But beyond that, it's a free market and a free society. That's the cultural background needed for innovation, which you will not find in countries like China and Russia. So we have that innovation, and we will continue to have it on into the future. I really don't want to sound too complacent, though. We have problems. We have an economy that's a mess. We have, I'm sorry to say, we have, besides the economy problem, we have the issues of what I would call a K through 12 educational problem. All I will say about that is there are problems. They need to be fixed. I believe we know how to fix them, and I believe in time we'll get our act together and we'll fix them.
And we'll get a chance to talk about that, in fact, in the panel.
And final comment here is people are wringing their hands about China rising or India rising. Fine, let them rise. This is not a zero-sum game. The world is big enough to have many countries rising and increasing. So that's what I want to say about our role in the world.
So if the U.S. is the dominant military power, if the U.S. is still sitting strong when it comes to all these other business and innovation and the rest of it, Secretary Shultz, how much should the U.S. be projecting its influence, its wishes on the rest of the world?
Well, let me step back to set the scene to answer that question a little bit. So I agree entirely with all the things that Bill said. But the world has emerged after World War II in a very strong way, and I think one of the main reasons is that with a lot of leadership from the United States, a global security and economic commons has been created that everybody has benefited from. China and India, you mentioned, they wouldn't have been able to rise had it not been for that commons to interact with and trade with and so on.
Commons, is that the word you use?
Like a commons, like a town commons, common ground in trade and security and so on. And I think that commons is being challenged by huge changes that are taking place that are deep but not really known by people. They haven't taken it on board. Let me just mention a couple of them. The demography of the world, the face of the world, is changing dramatically. All the developed countries, with the exception of the United States, have very low fertility, less than needed to sustain the population, high longevity, labor forces shrinking in proportion to the total. That affects their outlook, it affects their capability. In the case of Russia, it's a demographic basket case. In the case of China, it has had a fertility rate that dropped like a stone beginning about 30 years ago. That meant that they had a rising labor pool and a smaller number of people that the labor pool had to support, a demographic dividend. That's about to change like throwing a switch as the low fertility segments of the population take over. Suddenly we're going to see a declining labor pool and a rise in the number of people it has to support because of the rapidly aging population that's coming to China. Then we have Africa, the Middle East, the Maghreb, where fertility is still relatively high, longevity low, in other words, very young populations, and in many cases, populations with not much to do. So that's uneasy. Then you add to that one of the innovations that Bill talked about. I don't think we realize how deep the communication and information revolution penetrates. And it means that anybody anywhere can find out, if they take a little initiative, can find out almost anything. And they have the ability to communicate. So it used to be that the people in charge had a semi-monopoly of information and a monopoly of organizing capability. That's not true anymore. I might say you put that together with the population demographic dynamic I mentioned, and it's a toxic mix. Remember the little guy in Tunisia that's been written up, and he said, "Why are you doing this to me, to the state? All I want to do is work." They wouldn't let him work. They snuffed him out. He was a little entrepreneur. So now we have the Arab awakening. But I would point out to you that this awakening is happening all over the place. There's a Russian awakening going on. There's a Chinese awakening going on, and so on. Then you have, I'll stop, then you have the decline of sovereignty.
And I do want to.
You want to stop me, okay.
No, I want to listen to
so
you for hours and hours.
Sovereignty
and days
isn't what it used to be, in the sense of the world being made up of states that have some degree of control over what goes on their borders. There's less and less of that. So you mix these things together, and what the United States now confronts, as do others, is a world full of change. And we have to figure out how we can once again help recreate a global security and economic commons for the benefit of all of us.
So even as the U.S. remains this dominant force on the planet, there are a lot of changes happening that are outside the control of the United States, that are happening on their own, spontaneously, and just by the force of history. Secretary Bill Perry, so what does that say? You and I talked on the telephone the other day about the administration's, the Obama administration's new defense strategy, more emphasis on Asia. What in the near term should the United States be doing to be ready for the kind of world that the two of you are describing?
Well, George has described how technology changes are causing a new ease of communication, and that has profound implications as he's described. But another technological innovation is it has to do with nuclear power, and that has effectively put huge destructive power not in the hands just of nations, but more and more in the hands of smaller groups. Terror groups, for example, could conceivably get their hands on nuclear power. So the increase in destructive power in the hands not just of nation states, but small groups, is a huge new factor as well. And that's why we have to put such an important focus on stopping proliferation. So proliferation is one of the big problems of our day, which we have to deal with. And it has to do with the fact that this great technical advance has now put great destructive power in the hands of a small groups of people. That's another big factor, like the communication issue.
And that's
I might say that Bill and I, and Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, Sid Drell, have been advancing the notion of a world free of nuclear weapons. And Lee Annenberg was a great supporter of that idea.
But, you know, some people look at that and they think that's just a dream, it's not going to happen. The United States has so many nuclear weapons. Look at what's left in the former Soviet Union. Look at what these other countries, and I hope we have a minute or two this morning to get to Iraq, Iran, Pakistan.
Before your downer prevails here.
That's what reporters do, I'm sorry.
Let me point out that since this initiative got going and was taken up by both President Obama and Senator McCain, so a nonpartisan aspect to it, when you say, here's a goal, you say to yourself, how do we get there? Then you start thinking of specific things. One example, I think very promising, was the convening by President Obama of, I think, 49 nations in Washington about 2 years ago. And the object was, how do we get better control of fissile material? There's a follow-on conference in Korea coming in about a month to follow up. And as Bill was saying, the real problem is if a terrorist group gets its hands on fissile material, that's what they need. That's the hard part of getting a nuclear weapon. The easier part, not that it's easy, is making the weapon once you have the fissile material. So this is a step that's been taken as a result of an objective that I think is going to make the world a little safer.
So progress has been made?
Yes, definitely progress. But much, much, much more needs to be done. Sam Nunn has described the goal of new nuclear weapons as being the top of a mountain. He says we're way down at the bottom, and in fact we're sliding backwards, and he wants to start moving up. He doesn't know how to get to the top of the mountain. That's an impossible goal right now. But he wants to get up to a base camp where we can at least see the top of the mountain and know what we have to do to get there.
Well, it brings me, at least for a moment, to Iran and this back and forth that's been taking place between this administration, the Obama administration, Iran, and other countries. It's not just a U.S.-Iran equation. Is the U.S. pursuing the right policy right now with regard to putting pressure on Iran to the extent pressure can be applied?
Well, look, let's start off by saying there's a great danger of a military conflict with Iran now over the nuclear weapons, maybe even this year. The military conflict could be started by the United States. More likely, it would be started by Israel. Israel has been threatened by Iran. Their very existence has been threatened by Iran. And many people in Israel, including many people in the government of Israel, believe that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon or gets very close to a nuclear weapon, they need to take military action to stop that. So we are in danger of a military issue in conflict in Iran. That would have, and the Israelis realize this as well as we realize it, that would have a whole set of unintended consequences, most of them bad. So we should try to find ways of preventing that. Our diplomacy is intended to try to prevent that. It has not succeeded. But what is underway right now, just in the last few months actually, is actually getting into their banks, stopping their banks from functioning around the world. That's perhaps the most effective thing we've done so far. That has some hopes. It's hurting a lot there. It would be much more effective if we could get China and Russia to fully cooperate with that. My view is the diplomacy we ought to be conducting now with Iran ought to be with China and Russia, explaining to them if they don't cooperate with this, the consequences could well be a war, which would be much worse.
Are China and Russia likely to come to understand the U.S. position on this, the West position on this, and do what, and get the Iranians to stop?
Well, I think they should, because it's so blindingly obvious that it's in their interest not to have the war that Bill spoke about, but to get Iranian stuff under control. Iran keeps saying, just as an example, I don't throw this out like I'm Secretary of State or something, but just as an example.
But if you were.
Iran keeps saying that they're enriching uranium for peaceful purposes. Nobody believes them, but that's what they say. What if we said, okay, if that's your purpose, you're producing much more low-enriched uranium than you could possibly use yourself. In fact, the one reactor you have is being supplied by Russia. So it must be your intent is to be part of the commercial nuclear enrichment market. That's the only possible explanation for all this enrichment. So why don't we get together and we'll help you have access to that market. And we want to construct a regime, this is another one of the things that we have proposed, a step, where you have internationalized the nuclear fuel cycle, that is enrichment, spent fuel and so on, and invite Iran to become a part of that. If they're a part of that, that means that international people are in the enrichment facilities, help making them work, so you really know what's going on.
Do you think Iran would go along with that?
It might if it feels the toughness that Bill was talking about enough.
But this tension between the United States and Israel at this point over whether and when to move is very real right now.
Israel has already asked the United States to help them in this. The United States has not only refused, but has tried to talk them out of it. That was already in the Bush administration and repeated by the Obama administration. But in my judgment, if Israel believes that Iran has actually reached the point of a nuclear weapon, I don't believe they will wait for us. I believe they will operate by themselves. We will take all the negative consequences of what they do, but I think they will operate by themselves.
Do you agree?
Amen. I agree with whatever Bill says.
Okay. Let's talk about another easy part of the world.
We're colleagues at a place called Stanford, and we work things out there.
As I said,
George and I are demonstrating that bipartisan can happen occasionally.
As I said, many great institutions of higher learning in Cal. I know we only have a few minutes left, and I want to open it up to the audience, but another tough challenge facing the United States right now is in Pakistan. With the changing nature of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, there's a date certain for U.S. troop pullout. But the relationship with Pakistan after the killing of Osama bin Laden has just deteriorated and deteriorated. How worried are you about that, and how big a concern is it?
It is the most dangerous spot in the world today. Put together hundreds of nuclear weapons and building more, thousands, many tons of fissile material and building more, a very weak government, a violent and aggressive insurgency in the northwest part of the country, a continuing terrible relation with India over Kashmir. This is a volatile combination which could not only explode into a war, it could explode into a nuclear war. On top of that, beside the danger of a nuclear war, there's the danger that the fissile material or the bombs within Pakistan will fall into the hands of terrorists. How much worse can it get? That's what we're facing in Pakistan right now. And George is going to tell us how to solve this problem.
That's what I was going to ask you. What do we do?
Well, actually, Bill and I have been trying. A few months ago, we co-chaired a meeting where we brought a group of retired Indian generals and foreign minister types, and Pakistan similar, to Stanford, of all places. And we spent 2 days trying to help them find a way to compose their differences to a degree. And it was interesting because they did come up with a really impressive list of competence building measures in the nuclear arena. And they all signed their names to it, and they presented it to their respective governments. And in the process, we kept saying to them that you ought to think about better trade relations. That can help. And since that time, India had granted most favored nation status to Pakistan. Pakistan has reciprocated. Then a few weeks ago, we once again collaborated, and we brought a bunch of Pakistani influential people, former foreign ministers and so forth, and some U.S., some from the State Department, Defense Department, and NSC, once again at, of all places, Stanford. And we spent 2 days talking with them. And two things came out for me in addition to all the tension and difficulty. One is the huge lost opportunity for Pakistan that's resulting from all this tension. They have the possibility of an economy that could flower and raise standards of living dramatically. And this came out in the course of our discussions very powerfully, both by one of our economists and by a Pakistani economist who was terrific. So we want to get that goal up there. Here's what you're missing by what you're doing. And the other thing I think probably we need to face up to is that there's a general recognition that the drone strikes have done a lot of good. But they became so many that they have created a sense of unease. And I would think one of the things we should do is work out some sort of rules of engagement on drones that people understand and seem to get that situation where we use the drones but have a better sense that it's under control.
That's a case of new warfare creating new issues for diplomacy. Right? A new method of warfare that on the one hand seems so effective, but it's created new problems, and it's just, in fact, it's turned that relationship in a different direction between the U.S. and Pakistan.
Let me add to what George said, that during this meeting he was talking about, I called aside the senior Pakistani member. And this is the first meeting between India and Pakistan. I could tell that they did not like each other very much.
They're the most civilized people you could imagine, elegant people. And they could cut each other to ribbons in the most civilized way.
So I said to him, why are you even bothering to come to this meeting? He said, I'm coming because I think he's talking about Pakistan, are headed for a nuclear war, and I want to stop it. And I said, I want to do anything I can do to try to stop it. I said, why do you think you're heading for a nuclear war? He said, well, first of all, there are people in our country today who are plotting another Mumbai, another terrorist attack on India, and our government might not be able to stop them. If that happens, I don't believe the Indian government will show restraint this time. I think they will send a military force into Pakistan. If that happens, he said, the Pakistani army will be defeated and humiliated. They will go to their government and say, we should use nuclear weapons. We should use them only within our own country against the Indian army, and in that case, the Indian army will not reply with nuclear weapons. A very dubious proposition. That scenario he laid out to me, in my mind, suggests a full-scale nuclear war in South Asia, which would be absolutely catastrophic. His view was that was likely to happen, and he wanted to do everything he could to try to stop that from happening. That's the background for this discussion we were having.
We are going to wrap up, and I want to just wrap up with one final question for both of you. If you could whisper in the ear of three people, President Obama, Secretary of State Clinton, and Secretary of Defense Gates, now Secretary of Defense Panetta, words to the effect of something they need to be paying attention to right now, what would it be?
Develop our energy resources. That's the key to a lot of this. And we are on the cusp of a revolution. The fracking technology that's been developed fracking needs to be done carefully so we don't have unintended consequences. It has already revolutionized our supply of natural gas in this country. The price is down, probably less volatile. And the same thing is happening with oil. In North Dakota and southern Texas right now, there's a big oil boom. Our production level is starting up again for the first time. This technology is applicable all over the world. So it may be we're on the cusp of major change in energy. That will have a lot of impact. It'll have an impact on Iran. It may have an impact on China's attitude toward Iran and toward other oil places. I was in China recently, and I was fascinated that the man who will become premier raised this with him, and I was amazed that he was really on top of the subject and wanted to know all about need to get the technology. And he also said that we have to be careful and use this right so it doesn't blow up in our face in some manner.
He was speaking of fracking? Or?
Yeah. So that's what I would whisper in their ear. There's something really big and important taking place in energy, and it will change the geopolitical landscape, among other things.
And what would you whisper in the other ear?
Well, I would first of all say George is right. But I would elaborate that a little bit by saying besides supporting the things you're now supporting in energy, There are some new technologies coming along which can make a big difference too, particularly in the area of biofuel. And then the new different thing I would add to them is that put a greater emphasis on counter-proliferation. The one thing that can really cause a huge catastrophe in this country is if a terrorist got a hold of a nuclear bomb. That is all too likely to happen. We cannot guarantee it won't happen, but we can take steps to greatly lower the probability of it happening.
On that note, please join me in thanking these two extraordinary leaders, Secretary Shultz, Secretary Correspondent.
Very good.
It's good to be with you. Really good to you. Thank you, thank you.